Hello, welcome to another edition of I'm Bastani with me, Aaron Bastani, at Aaron Bastani on Twitter. As ever, thank you so much for watching. Today I want to talk about Tata Steel, the British steel industry, the immense problems that are facing British manufacturing right now. I'd like to talk about some solutions too. You'll probably know why I want to talk about Tata Steel. That's because late last month, Tata's board rejected a turnaround plan, particularly in relation to its Port Talbot presence, that's in Wales. Big plant, employs I think over 2,000 people. Hell of a lot more when you introduce all the other people working across the supply chain. Services, of course, that are supported by that plant. A lot of people's jobs up for grabs here that could be lost. Big loss to that community. They rejected that turnaround plan. Tata Steel, basically, the short of it is they're in big trouble. In the 3 months to February this year, they lost £68 million. They're losing £1 million a day. So the problems at Tata Steel, Port Talbot, are emblematic of a crisis in the industry generally. Other firms have played their part in what amounts to an industry-wide catastrophe. In October last year, Thailand's SSI announced it was closing down its Redcar works with a loss of 2,200 jobs. Then parts of Caparo Industries steel operation went into administration, putting 1,700 jobs potentially at risk. So why is this happening? Why are there problems in Britain's steel industry? Last year it was profitable. Okay, last year Tata was making money in Britain, so what's changed so quickly, so dramatically, that they're losing £1 million a day, okay? Now, some people, the usual suspects, are saying it's because of climate change, measures taken by the government, particular incentives and taxes and measures. That's simply not true, it doesn't make any sense. The things they're talking about, government regulation around carbon emissions and so on, accounts for about 1 or 2% of the cost of producing steel in the UK. So that's not the culprit, Dan Hannan. That's not the culprit, Nigel Farage. Sorry to disappoint you. Nor, fortunately, are we hearing the laments of the 1970s, 1980s that the problem is British workers, how lazy they are, industrial strife, how they're so greedy, how they want more. Nobody's saying that, right? That's what would have been said 20, 30 years ago. British industry is not competitive on the world market because our workers are so lazy. That was the big thing in the 1970s, right? Nobody's saying that anymore because industrial activism in this country, industrial strike action, has never been lower. And yet we've lost these industries, right? What explains, basically over the course of the last 12 months, the collapse of the steel industry in Britain? Well, actually, you don't need to look any further than a quote here from a Tata official only 2 months ago when they made appeals to the UK government, which remained unheard and unanswered until the shit really hit the fan, and that was late last month. Here I quote, "Growing European steel demand continues to be undermined by a flood of imports into the region. The European Steel Association has identified that Chinese steel is being exported at prices below the cost of production. This unfair trade is undercutting domestic producers and harming the European steel industry, which employs many thousands of people and is at the foundation of much of the region's cutting-edge innovation." The short of it is that British steel is in big trouble, it's in big danger, just like the rest of Europe, but Britain in particular, because of dumping measures being taken by the Chinese, but also the South Koreans and the Russians too. So what does that mean, dumping? It means that right now, China in particular, China is by far and away the world's biggest steel producer, by the way. China in particular is producing steel that is cheaper than anything to buy, than anything that could be produced in the UK, okay? So if you're procuring steel in the UK, you are not going to buy British steel because the Chinese steel is cheaper to buy than it is to produce here. Even if manufacturers here were making zero profit, just covering their costs, the Chinese stuff would be cheaper, okay? So nobody can be critical of those buying the stuff. It makes perfect sense. Now, why is that? Why is Chinese steel so cheap? It's not because the production processes over there are particularly innovative or new, or they've got high levels of automation, okay? It's not because they've got a more efficient steel industry or they're harder workers. It's very simple. It's because, broadly speaking, the entire Chinese steel industry is state-owned and they get massive state subsidies, okay? Which mean that they can produce steel cheaper than anybody else anywhere in the world. They can undercut anybody in the private sector that's producing this stuff for profit. Now, why would China do that? Why would the Chinese Communist Party be saying to its domestic steel industry, we'll give you loads of money, we'll give you loads of state support, and you can undercut everybody else. Why would they do that? Okay. Well, you may have a Starbucks on your local high street. And you're probably very familiar with the strategy they adopted a long time back. A lot of cafes do the same thing, right? There's one on the high street, then there's two, then there's three, then there's four. You go to Tottenham Court Road, I think there's like 5 Cafe Neros in London. Now, why do they do that? They do that to try and eliminate all competition, and then they hoover up the whole market. Okay? That's what China right now is trying to do in the global steel industry. So, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, what's he saying? What's dish-faced free market Lothario saying about all of this? He says, well, we need to find a private buyer for Port Talbot, for Tata Steel. We need to find a private buyer. Now think, okay? If you have a competitor who's producing something more cheaply than you could ever produce, even if you weren't making a profit, who in their right mind would buy that company, those factories? You are entering an industry which you cannot make any profit in. This sort of feeds into a bigger thing we see with the Tories, right? The immediate response to what's going on Port Talbot was they say, well, look, the government can't intervene, the state can't intervene, let the market decide, let the market, the free market decide the price of global steel. The point is, the price is being decided by the Chinese Communist Party. The price is being decided by state-owned Chinese steel companies, right? With huge state support. This is not the free market, okay? It's anything but. And then on top of that, a lot of people, very justifiably, right, are saying, well, if we can bail out the banking industry, why can't we bail out manufacturing? Why can't we bail out steel? To some extent, that's true. Why can't we? Yeah. If you can bail out Northern Rock and Lloyds and RBS and all these people, why can't you bail out Tata Steel, right? On the one hand, that can be explained through a preference, basically, for the financial interests of the city over the manufacturing interests of the rest of the country outside of the City of London, okay? That's one explanation, but also, bear in mind, the Tories weren't in power in 2008 when the global financial crisis kicked off. And actually, for all the criticisms that can be made of Gordon Brown and his premiership, if it wasn't for Gordon Brown, the global financial crisis would have been dealt with very, very differently. Looking at the Tories, I actually think they would have been far less competent in that situation. I think probably they would have overseen the collapse of the British banking system. Maybe the global financial crisis would have actually really been as big as 29 or bigger had George Osborne been Chancellor, right? I actually think it would have been, okay? I actually think it would have been. That's an interesting thought, isn't it? A Tory Chancellor presiding over the complete collapse of the British financial system. Wouldn't that have been fantastic? I mean, the thing is, this guy's built a reputation of competence. The truth is, he's never had a job outside of politics, except for one, which was folding towels at Selfridges. He's a buffoon. He was in the right place at the right time, i.e. after the global financial crisis, and he went to the right schools and the right university. Other than that, this gentleman has zero qualifications to be running this country's economy. John McDonnell, a 4-point plan. My boy Mache, talked about something in Sunday Mirror. Here we go. 4-point plan outlined by John McDonnell, Shadow Chancellor. Number 1, stabilise the industry, protect steel workers by allowing time for a buyer to be found, but being prepared to nationalise plants threatening closure. Number 2, fast-track key investment projects like high-speed rail, build them with British steel. Number 3, create a level playing field. The Tories must stop blocking EU initiatives to protect steel, but also look at business rates and energy prices. Number 4, restructure the industry so it has a future in partnership with workers, management, major customers working alongside government. Now, I love Mache. I love Labour. Okay, now I'm a Marxist, but as many of you know, I'm a big fan of the Corbyn project. Okay, I'm really optimistic about it, by the way. Doing really well recently, right? But here I have to take exception with some of the things that Mache is saying. Number 3, create a level playing field. How? Unless you're going to remove the Chinese Communist Party from, China, okay? Unless you are going to all of a sudden have the same industrial policy as China, how? How are we going to create a level playing field? I mean, it's not going to happen, right? And if it's going to happen, it's going to take the best part of 10 years, okay? How are we going to create a level playing field? How? We can't, okay? So it's being a bit disingenuous there. I mean, there's a lot to agree with there, but we can't create a level playing field in the short to medium term, right? That's just not going to happen. Unless, of course, we don't look for that. We try and nationalise them, right? Which would be my solution. McDonald's also gone on record to saying that nationalisation should only be a last option, that a private buyer should be the first port of call. But as I've already said, it's not profitable to make steel in the UK right now, so how is a private buyer going to buy this thing? It's not going to happen, John. It's not going to happen. Now, I know politically John McDonnell's really limited here. He can't go and call for nationalisation outright, as I'm sure he'd love to do. But we need to start making these arguments, right? Because if a private buyer goes and buys this thing, it's just going to flop again in 6 months' time. And worst case scenario, and I actually think this is what's going to happen, right? This is what the Tories are going to do. They are and it's criminal. What they'll do is, right, they'll put the liabilities of Tata Steel onto the taxpayer, a couple of £1 billion worth of pensions liabilities, and then they'll sell it off, all the goodies. Maybe not the whole thing, maybe just the really profitable parts of the operation, right? That's what they'll do. That's what they'll do. They allow the gains to go to private individuals and they socialise the losses onto us. The muggy taxpayers who then go and vote for these fucking pricks in 5 years' time. Well, hopefully that won't happen in 2020, right? Now, personally, I agree with my boy Paul Mason at Paul Mason News. He's got a great proposal. Paul. I think it's very strong. He says nationalise the business, then turn it into mutual with permanent state support reflecting its strategic importance to national security. Now, I don't really care about national security. Here's this kind of weird Cold War thing where he's big on national security, but that's an important point, right? You can't really have an armed forces without steel industry, okay? Because if you go to war, you need to ratchet up plane production, you need to have missiles, you need to have tanks, armoured vehicles, you need steel. You need steel. A modern economy has needed steel for 100 years. It's kind of amazing that we have a government which thinks we don't need a steel industry. It's really amazing. I mean, you can't produce weapons without them, you know. The Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese must be laughing at this stuff. They go, how fucking stupid are the Brits? So you have the Industrial Revolution, you have this head start over everybody else, you piss it away after about 50 years because you have idiots like George Osborne's ancestors running the country. Anyway, Paul Mason's proposal I think is a fantastic one. I think that's exactly what Labour should be looking to do. Tata Steel, all these problems exemplify a big thing for me, which is this. Britain hasn't really had an industrial policy for the best part of 4 decades, right? China has an industrial policy. That's why it is pissing on the competition globally. Pissing on them, okay? Laughing at people like David Cameron. They're going, look at that dish-faced he looks like a ham, but he also has no idea about global economics. It got to a point under New Labour that the country which gave the world the Industrial Revolution had an industrial policy which amounted to nothing more than saying that globalisation was good, that isn't it fantastic you can buy chorizo at the local Tesco, and great, we can go to Alicante with EasyJet for 60 quid. I mean, it was a fucking palaver, right? It was just ridiculous. And New Labour and the Tories were as much to blame with this stuff. And we need to go beyond that. We need to have an industrial policy. I'd say we need to have an industrial policy that looks at fully automated luxury communism. Okay? So where does steel... Now we're getting there. This is where we are, people. This is how close we are now. We need to start talking about industrial policy for fully automated luxury communism. People are smelling this in the air. This is a political program. It's real. It's happening. It's coming to a place near you soon. We're going to need steel to build all those urban farms. We're going to need steel to build all those electric cars. And you know what? We're going to need steel to build all those household robots. I mean, who else is going to massage us, take our dogs for walks and so on, right? There's going to be the robots. We're going to need steel. So even if you're not a state socialist like me, I think you have to be smart and savvy about this and say, look, the government needs to nationalise its steel industry and we need to be looking at mutualising this thing in a couple of years' time. So in short, Brits want good jobs, good pay. They should have all that, but I think the big difference between me and say the TUC is I say, let's have great jobs, great pay, but let's have a 3-day week, right? We don't need a 5-day week. They also want great services at low cost. Now, what the Tories have done for the last 25 years is they've said the answer to all of that is privatisation, okay? You want a great service that's cheap, privatisation is the way to do it. Nearly the entire public now recognise that's complete crap, okay? We're in a situation where we've got train operators in this country being privatised, being run by publicly owned train operators abroad. They're creaming it from high fares here as well as state subsidies, but we won't bring trains domestically into public ownership. Bananas. Similar thing now with steel, right? And that's reflected in opinion polls. The public knows that privatisation, when it comes to a load of stuff, utilities, now steel, education, health, is not the way to go. There's a huge shift in public opinion around this. The only problem is right now an alternative is not being offered. We're seeing the glimpses of it with Labour, but John, you need to be honest. We need nationalisation, old son. So what do you think? You know what I think? I think we need to start talking seriously about industrial policy under fully automated luxury communism. We're Marxists, we're communists, we're people that are going to change the world. We need to not just have the critiques, but also the solutions. Why don't you put some of those solutions down on the hashtag? The hashtag Aaron Bastani. Reach out to me at Aaron Bastani or Novara Media at Novara Media.